All right, so what we're doing in this section is we're going to learn how to solve things that have been factored. We're going to start off by solving ones that are actually factored. So first of all, we have to know what standard form is. Standard form is when you have the polynomial, binomial, trinomial written out without parentheses, without it being factored. Factored form is when you actually take it and you factor it. So this is the standard form. This is the factored form. Standard form, factored form. And we haven't talked about factoring, which we'll get to in a little bit, but we just want to see the difference between these two. Okay. We're going to start off by just learning how to solve them, and then we're going to actually start learning how to factor them. All right, so the first set of problems we have is when things are in factored form. Well, the way you get a 0 is if this is either equal to 0 or this one is equal to 0, because 0 times anything is 0. So what we do is we are actually going to set both of those things equal to 0. So x is equal to 0 right here. That's one answer. The way we find the other answer is x minus 5 equals 0. This one is already solved. So we know that if we plug in a 0, when we multiply it out, we'll get a 0. But then for this one, I solve this equation by adding 5 on both sides. And I get x as 5. So if I plug a 5 into the equation here, when I multiply out, I'd also get a 0. And so those are the two answers that when I plug in will give me a 0. All right, let's look at this next one. Same thing. I set my first factor to equal 0. And to get rid of a plus 3, I minus 3, so x is negative 3. So there's the first answer. And over here, I set this equal to 0, so x minus 4 equals 0. And to get rid of a minus 4, you add 4, so x is positive 4. So if I plug in a 4 to either of those x's or both of those x's, this parentheses will give me a 0. And then that would be 7 times 0 equals 0. All right, last one. Let's change colors one more time. So we're going to do this one. 2x is equal to 0. Remember, this says 2 times x. And the way you get rid of a 2 times x is you divide by 2. And 0 divided by 2 is just 0. And then over here, this one's a little harder, but it's still a process we could do. We set it to 3x plus 5 equals 0. We have to get rid of the plus 5 first. So to get rid of a plus 5, we minus 5. So 3x is negative 5. And then we divide both sides by 3. So x is negative 5 over 3. And so those are the two answers that would give me 0. All right, what I'd like you to do now is I would like you guys to try numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 to see what you get. Once you think you have it, go ahead and press play. All right, so for this first one, I get x plus 2 is equal to 0. And to get rid of a plus 2, I minus 2. So my first answer is negative 2. And on this side, to get rid of the minus 3, I add 3 on both sides, so x is positive 3. So those are the two solutions. Here, I have a squared, and what that means is I just have the same thing twice. Maybe you remembered that and you wrote that out. And so now x minus 4 is equal to 0. So that's x is 4. But then if you notice, if I do the same thing here, I get the same answer. So really, whenever you have an exponent here, you don't have to do it twice. You just have to do it once. But the two answers are 4. All right, this one, number 3, you should have gotten 3 answers because there's 3 x's. And so here, x minus 3 is 0. So x is 3. This one we'll do down here. X plus 1 is 0. So x is negative 1. And for this one, 2x minus 3 is 0. So we add 3 to both sides, and we get 2x is 3. And then the way you get rid of a times 2 is you divide by 2. So x is 3 over 2. You can leave it as an improper fraction, You can leave it as, you can make it 1 1/2, or you can make it 1.5. It really doesn't matter. All right, and let's look at number 4. For this one, x minus 1 equals 0. It is squared, so it means that answer is twice, but you don't have to write it twice. So I just get x is 1. And then for this one, 3x plus 1 equals 0. To get rid of a plus 1, I minus 1 on both sides, so I get a negative 1. And to get rid of a times 3, I divide by 3. So x is negative 1/3. Okay? All right, so let's look at the next part. For the next part, we're actually going to start doing some factoring. And so it's asking us, first of all, to find the GCF. Well, the GCF is the greatest common factor. So what we're looking for the biggest thing that goes into both. So I'm going to kind of model it with a couple of examples. And so I'm going to show the long process right now, and then eventually we'll start working with the shorter process. So 3x squared is just 1 times 3. We don't really need to write the 1 because a 1 doesn't matter, but it's 3 with 2 x's. For 12x, I need to break it down and to find the least common. I need to find the multiples of 12, or the factors of 12. So to find factors, I can use a factor tree. 2 goes into 12 6 times, and then 2 goes into 6 3 times. And so my factors are 2 times 2 times 3, and then this one only has 1x. All right, what I do now is I look to see what both of them have. Okay, so they both have a 3, and they both have an x. The top one has another x, but the bottom one doesn't have an x, so I can't count that. The bottom one has 2's, but the top one doesn't, so I can't count that. So the GCF is what I highlighted, is just 3x. All right, let's try number 7. I need to write what 4x squared is, and then I need to write what 10x is. So I'd like you to try and list this out in factored form for 4x squared and 10x. And when you think you have it, go ahead and press play. So 4 is just 2 times 2, so it's 2 times 2, and then I write out my 2 x's. And 10 is 2 times 5, so I do 2 times 5, and I write out my x. Now that you see what the factored form is of each one, see if you can circle or highlight what each one has. So you should have gotten a 2 in each of them, and you should have gotten 1x in each of them. So then that means the factored form is 2x. Not the factored form, I'm sorry. The GCF is 2x. All right, let's look at this last one. So x squared is just x times x, and then 7x is just 7 times x. And so we look at what both of them have, and the most they have in common is an x. And so the GCF of this is just x. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do some of this process up here, see if we can find solutions once we take out a GCF. So the first thing we have to do is we have to try and factor it. So for this lesson, I'm going to still take out this process of kind of thinking what I have in both. And I have a 5x squared, so that's 5x and x. And then this one is 15x. So that's, let's see, 15 is just 3 times 5 with an x. And so they both have a 5. They both have an x. And so on the outside, that's what I have. Now, the way I find out what's left over is you can also do it this way. Sometimes people will divide this because I took out a 5x. 5 divided by 5 is 1. I had 2 x's. I took 1 out, so I'm left with 1 inside. And then I also divide this by 5x. 15 divided by 5 is 3. And the x's are gone. So it's just 3. And so now we do our process of setting each thing equal to 0. And so to get rid of a times 5, I divide. So my first answer, kind of ran out of space, is 0. And then over here, to get rid of a plus 3, I minus 3, so x is negative 3. All right, over here, we're going to try number 10 without doing this factoring right here. We're going to try without doing that, because I would like you to be able to do it without having to write it out. But if this step helps you, by all means, you should use that step. Another thing is, if you notice here, I highlighted the 5x. The x was what's left over, so that's what went in the parentheses. And down here, I highlighted the 5x. The thing that was not highlighted was 3, and so that goes in parentheses. All right, here. So we need to look and see what's the biggest number that 4 and 2 both have in common. And that's 2, so I could take a 2 out. So I'm going to divide both of those by 2. The most x's I can always take out is the smallest amount. So I can take out 1x from each of them. And again, if we like to write it out, that's because 2 times 2, and then xx, and then 2x is 2 times x. And then we have a 2 and an x in each of them. And so that's why we take out a 2x. So now I'm left with 2x minus, look at this, nothing's left on this one right here. You see that? You have to have something there. Well, this is where this process is helpful. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And so that lets you know that that's 1. And so now I set each thing equal to 0. So I divide by 2, and so x is 0 for this first answer. Over here, I'm going to add 1 to both sides, so I get 2x is 1. And then I'm going to divide by 2, so I get x is 1/2. And that's it. So we started off by just learning how to solve if they're in parentheses. And remember, you set each piece equal to 0 and solve. And then we started learning about GCFs. And this process of doing the factor tree and listing them all out might really help you. So if it helps you, you should use it.